Welcome to Free the Mind, Free the People, a podcast where we come together to empower each other through knowledge and discuss the issues that shape our everyday lives. All opinions and information shared in this podcast are held by the host alone and do not represent the stances of the University of Central Florida and the Department of Sociology.
Hi everyone, Marina here. We just wanted to give you a bit of a rundown of where we left off in part 1 of this episode. Previously, we talked about how we see social change as a pendulum rather than linear, Black feminists' ideas of collective care versus mainstream ideas of self-care, and how to navigate social justice movements in the midst of fear of quote-unquote cancel culture. Here, we continue discussing the complexity of collective action and community, as well as our own philosophies for resisting oppression and achieving social change. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that, and that's where our own, as we've said throughout this entire series, like redirecting our outrage, it's not about you as an individual as much as it is about social structures that have shaped you, yes, but so when we're discussing these things, like, we have to be able to look beyond us, beyond ourselves, and understand there's a bigger social structure going on. And when we challenge you as a person because you had some racist, sexist behavior, we're not going after you necessarily, as a person, as an individual. We're just pointing you to the fact that, hey, you are perpetuating the system that you claim to want to challenge. So, you are still a product of it. We all are. So it's about meeting in that place and not resisting the urge to go, fight each other, and opt out, as I said, opt out of these movements because one person pointed you to something that was reproducing the system that you're trying to challenge. So it really is a balance, and it is something that we need to sit with. And I think that we are, again, going back to my point about wanting quick answers and quick solutions. I think generally in our neoliberal society, we are not used to sitting with complexity of things, and like that many things can be true at once, and that we will always have conflict, and that's okay. Like, you don't have to leave a group just because you had one conflict. Like, that's society. And so we'll talk more about later about our personal philosophies, but one thing that I've noticed is that at least just as I've progressed in my just learning about these things and social issues and how to respond to them, I think that we do need to move from, like, back in 2016 when we were just like blue versus red, like like that was the whole thing. I think that in terms of election, I think that we need to understand that things are much more complex than that, and it's not about fighting each other, and it's not about avoiding conflict. It's about working through the conflict and sitting with each other through the conflict, because, as I say, in going to the leftist movements, don't come for me, leftist movements, but but like, sometimes I'm like, sure, you can have a club with, with your ideology, sure, with people that are like-minded, but at the same time, the revolution is not gonna be just y'all. Like, the revolution, we still have neighbors, like, that don't think like us. So it's also understanding, like, wait a second, we want this better society, and every single person around us is not going to be like-minded to us. It just won't. It's not going to be like that. So it's really just, again, sitting with the complexity and sitting through the conflict.
That's a very good point. I like that. Sitting with the complexity and the conflict, because they compose as they compose, like, those two elements compose as enemies in contention, right? And so going back to feelings, like, people can get so weighted and bogged down with the feelings, how I feel about something or how someone feels about something. when in some cases we have to move beyond how we feel about it in order to actually deal with it, in order to actually deal with the conflict and confront it, and then, you know, deal with the contention, you know, and that kind of thing. So being okay to say, okay, this is what I can do to address this, or this is, you know, my thought process on this. Let me sit through this. Let me think about it, because it's not instantaneous. It's not overnight. You know, we didn't get to where we are materially, and also, you know, philosophically speaking, or anything like that overnight. Like it took time. And so sitting with that, I think that's a very good statement. I like that statement.
Thank you. Improvised.
I mean, really getting to like, you know, the gist of our conversation, or some of our conversation, when it comes to this element of resistance and like what that means. And so, you know, words have an amazing meaning in the words that we use, and the language that we use, and how we expound on things and explain things, and also how we see things, how we perceive and experience. And so no two people are alike. You know, we can come from the same family, you know, we even twins that are born, you know, right after the other, they're so different. Like no two people are like, no two people share the same perspective all the way through, line by line, point by point. And sometimes we can look at the same thing and see things differently from it. You know, just like looking at a picture, we can take from that different things. And so that reminds me, or brings me to our sociological imagination, to where we can see, you know, not just our own experiences, but going beyond that and seeing and understanding the experiences of others. And at the same time, to not other people, right? So not to go through this process of othering, but to remember that the experiences that I have, we have, people around the world have that. And people around the world have, you know, experiences beyond that as well, that some people can't even fathom. And so realizing and employing the sociological imagination to see beyond ourselves and our experiences and our family, to realize and understand, well, that is why people react that way, or people think that way. Okay, that is why people feel isolated or alone or depressed, or whatever the case might be, because this thing goes beyond me, you know, and those that are around me. And so I just think there's value to that. There's value to what Charles Wright Mills was getting at with this idea. People will act a certain way and react a certain way. You know, to every action, there's a reaction. I think that's a scientific understanding, that everything causes some type of reaction. There's always some type of, just like putting, you know, a stone or whatever in the pond, there's going to be a reaction, no matter how large or small that is. And so through these experiences that people around the world have, they don't have the luxury of taking off this hat or taking off that hat. Like, they're dealing with that experience in and of themselves, all around them. It's like a glove, you know, it encompasses. And so the loneliness that people experience, or whatever it is that people deal with and go through, they don't have the luxury to just take it off, because
Right.
it's overreaching, you know, and burdensome. And so understanding that we don't need to be alone, and we need community, and we need one another, because that's better for our health. And so this idea of being alone and being isolated is that in and of itself is oppressing and depressing and repressing. And so if we notice, like, the social institutions and organizations that really try to drive this loneliness, and then looking at the phone for like friends and likes, and that's not what we were intended to do. We were intended to be together and build one another, and be honest with one another, and have a sense of morality, and have a sense of ethics, like you said. And in that sense, and that's the reason why these social institutions and organizations don't want that, is because there is power. There's power in our numbers. There is power in our togetherness. And so, as opposed to being divided. And so a house divided cannot stand. A family divided cannot, you know. So coming together is power. It's speaking back to power. It's a threat to power, to evade power, and, you know, the things that are trying to be enacted to change our course and to change our destiny. And so these ebbs and flows that we experience through life try to inflict fear, or try to inflict pain, so that way people will go back and say, well, I'd rather be comfortable, you know, in my own experiences, rather than to dibble dabble, you know, out here and try to help. And so, you know, through that, you know, people get to experience what Black people of color experience. And it's not comfortable. No. Hello, it's not. And it is painful, and it is all those things. And so you respond to the resistance by saying, you know what, I get it, as opposed to, I don't want to deal with this, let me go back home, kind of thing.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I think it's really funny you mentioned, like, you know, Black people specifically for many years have been told they can't speak, and they can't exist in public, and they can't say what they need to do. But then as soon as, like, white men on Twitter are told they can't talk about something, they call it cancel culture. And it's like, welcome to what marginalized people have been feeling for like years and years and years in this society. But now it's become a problem because we are speaking back to the power and saying, we don't want you to say this stuff anymore. And now it's like, oh no, cancel culture, this is so bad. And so it, like, this is what, like you said, this is what people have been experiencing for years, for such a long time.
Yeah, so I think that moving into like our last little section in this conversation, now that we've discussed shifting our focus beyond ourselves and into these bigger structures, so it can be a little daunting. Because it's like, so what as a person myself can I do? And so we've discussed like coalitions and like there's also voting, activism, protests, etc. And so we just kind of, in this last section, we want to discuss the limitations that we face in some ways in terms of addressing these issues, but also our own personal philosophies. So yes, let's have that conversation.
Yeah. So I found, like, as a college student, it was really helpful to have a lot of political organizations around me in my university. So like if you are in college and you're looking for places and organizations to work with, there are definitely a lot on campus. And even then, there are state chapters for a lot of these organizations. So if you're not in college, you just graduated or whatever, there are larger chapters to these organizations that you can find. So that is really helpful. But even within our institutions, we are limited in our actions. Like, you know, when the decision about Roe v. Wade came out, my friends and I were talking about going to protests, and some people were like, I'm scared. Like, I'm now scared to go to protests. I'm scared of like the police presence. I'm scared of someone coming in and attacking the people at the protest. Like, I don't know if I'm ready to go out there. And so to me, through a sociological lens, this is kind of something called the panopticon, which is like a form of self-discipline. Like, we fear the discipline that we will face, so we do it to ourselves instead. And so we were so scared of what would happen if we went out and protest, so we stopped ourselves from protesting before that even happened. And so, we can say like, oh, go protest, or like just go out there and fight, but like it's not that simple. So that's something to keep in mind as we're thinking about these different ways that we can go about it. But I still think like finding organizations is very important to building that coalition.
And again, I think that, so in terms of those limitations, we also talk about the iron cage in sociology. And just sort of this idea that we are living in a system, a structure that was developed over the years, and now we're trapped in it. And so I think that that's part of it, just being stuck in this structure that we didn't create ourselves. But as Kristal said, that's those ripples of, reactions and things that happen unintentionally, but here we are. And so I know we discussed a little bit about, in the previous episode, about campus, like having like protests on campus, and the limitations that UCF organizations face in those terms, not being able to protest. And I know this is something that you'll go into, Kristal, a little bit, but like in terms of like anti-riot laws and things like that. Just we will get somebody, a speaker that comes to campus like Matt Walsh, and then we can't really go protest because either whichever organization decides to protest could lose their status within the university, or we get arrested because it's now illegal to do this. So there's those real limitations there.
Yeah, I think that that if we think about it, like this conversation really evolves and has this this message in it to where we can see the forms of power and systems of power that are at play. And so what do we do with that? And different things are enacted or adopted as a way to steer people from coming together. And so, it's almost like, well, if this doesn't work, then maybe that will work. And so there are, and I don't want to individualize this because we are talking about structures and systems, but through those structures and systems, there are rules and policies that are or were adopted long time ago. Like what we are talking about and dealing with is sedimented in the structure, because these policies and rules were written a long time ago. So everything that we're seeing today is like a build on to that foundation that was previously laid. And so someone else comes in, and so someone else comes in. And so all these people, like we can think of individual people, and we don't have to call them out, but we can think of individual people that have been a pawn, if you will, or some type of player in the game on this foundation that's already been built. So it's like we have to look past the people and look at the foundation and, you know, break up that foundation. And if we break up that foundation, then we're undoing this mess that we're in. We're undoing this iron cage. And so that's like the driver here is that foundation. And so everything that we do, whether it's getting together and raising our signs up, all of those are forms of movements and ways to speak back to power that we decide to go out and do, right? That's a social movement. Our bodies there physically, like Halley talked about, and raising awareness and raising advocacy and raising our voices. So the bills that are passed and the things that are done are ways to monopolize on that and to use that like against us. And so I would tell people to use the ability and the power that you have in ways that you know, in order to encourage change. You know, it's very daunting, and it really makes you sit and think like, wow, you know. But I think at the end of the day, like we have to do what we can while we can.
Yes.
You know, and we have to have that courage to stand and face systems of power, because we have power, which is why that fear is like on the other end or on the other side, is because we have power. And sometimes I don't think we realize that as people, like regardless of who we are. And so that is why these laws and bills are, you know, posed to be passed. They're presented to be passed because there is this power that we actually have.
Right. And this anti-riot law that we're talking about, which was attempted to be passed in Florida, it basically was a way to like criminalize rioting. But the catch was that there was a very broad definition of riot. And so basically they would be able to take any group of people protesting something as a riot and criminalize it. And so that's what's frustrating about it. That's what makes people scared to go out, even though it's in response to our power. And this law also had a very strong emphasis on like private property destruction. So they cared way more about the buildings and just like these material objects that were being that could be hurt in protests, rather than like the people. Like when these protests happen, they're protesting some form of like police brutality or like some form of hurt, malicious intent towards human lives. But what they are emphasizing is private property. And I think that's really interesting to show where their priorities lie. Like, obviously, they care about property over human lives. And they obviously don't want us to fight for, like, the safety of human lives either. That's not what they want us to do. And luckily, this law was challenged by some judges. But it will be re-upped in the courts again. They're going to take it back and see if they can pass it. So, like, this is an example of a law that's just supposed to scare people out of going on protesting, because they're just criminalizing protesting altogether.
Yes, and I think that there are new attempts at establishing more laws against protesting and all those things. I'll try to find some links to put below the episode. But I think that, and I really like what you bring up, Kristal, as well, like the idea that we still have to do something. And I think that we we've already seen things that have driven people to show up, like in terms of like mass protests. And so like seeing something as undeniable as what happened with George Floyd, and seeing the video and all of that, like that seemed to have a type of reaction for people that hadn't happened in the past, or in the near, like close to that time, I guess. And so I think that my thought process is, yes, there are these limitations, but I think that there is also the aspect of, there will come a time when people will be pushed so far their breaking point that we'll have to do something. We'll have to show up. We'll have to risk our safety. And I think that, again, going in terms of globally, like in the United States, in some ways we have a lot of privilege that there are other people in other countries don't have. And we've seen people show up in other countries to basically take down their governments that are oppressing them. I know Iran is a case, and I myself have seen it with Puerto Ricans. So it's something that I think we'll get there at some point, I think. So these limitations are not completely, what I'm trying to say is, there are limitations that they are there, but I think that there's still space in the future for people to break out of that and achieve something. And it will take the collective that you're talking about, Kristal. Like if it's about us individually, and if we continue, understanding our safety as our individual safety only. So like we only care for our friends. We only like watch out for our friends and for ourselves. Obviously that's not going to work. But if we build, hopefully, a collective type of self-care where you don't have to be my friend for me to care for you, like it's
right.
more about caring for everyone, for each other, then I think that's where that can be achieved, those mass movements that we've seen elsewhere. So it is possible, basically. It's possible because it's happened in the past and it's happening right now elsewhere.
And just think about too, what we're talking about is this idea, and it's not even, it's more than an idea, but just, bear with me on that framing. But resistance, like that's what we're talking about. And free the mind, free the people. I mean, think about these words that we're using. And so the whole idea, the whole point of resistance is going against the grain. And, another way of putting it is kicking against the prick. So it's going to hurt. It's going to have it's going to have that lack of comfort, if you will, because it's not about being comfortable, because we should be uncomfortable, and it's okay to be uncomfortable. And so when we resist, we are opposing and refusing to accept and having a hostility and an aversion towards something. And so society paints this picture that is bad. And so we should want to be comfortable. Think about all the different quote unquote comforts in life, so keeping that resistance in mind to where it's different than from our natural inclination, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
Yes. And so I think that this leads us perfectly into kind of the last bit of this conversation in terms of, so the different strategies that there are, because again, we agree that there isn't one single solution and one single way to go about this. We in fact need everything we can get at the same time. And so in one of our courses, it was social theory, we talked about Eric Outrage. He's a Marxist sociologist, and he wrote a book called Envisioning Real Utopias. And in that book, he provides these three modes, or he calls models of transformation. And so he compiled sort of these three strategies out of all the movements that he's studied. And so we have like the group which he calls ruptural, basically the group that attacks the state. They just confront it, they go against it, and so there's that strategy of going directly like against attacking the state. Then there's also the more what he calls a more anarchist type strategy, which is to build alternatives outside of the state to challenge it in that way. So, and we've seen that in the past as well. And lastly, what aligns with the social democratic idea or political ideology, he discusses like using the state as sort of kind of like struggling within the state, struggling within the structure, trying to change things from within, pretty much. And so, and I forgot to mention, the first one is more known as revolutionary socialist or revolutionary communist. So these are just kind of the political ideologies that fall within those frameworks. But broadly, like beyond those parties or political ideologies, we can see these strategies being used across time and space by different movements. And so now we wanted to put that out there for anybody that might be interested. We'll have a link below about that. But now we kind of wanted to open up about our own personal philosophies. And so, Halley, I'll let you lead us there.
Yeah, I think that this is really important because if you are also thinking about how you want to move forward in creating social progress and social change, you might not yet know what your philosophy is. You might not even know there are different philosophies. So you can use this chart. You don't have to use this one specifically, but just knowing the idea that there are many ways to go about this. Find the ones that connect with you the most, that you're most comfortable with or uncomfortable with, as we just stated, and see how you want to progress forward in your social change. Because like, as a white woman, I grew up being socialized that the state can save us, that passing laws for gender equality and racial equality will create the change that we need. And, you know, slowly over time, I've recognized the privilege in believing in the state because it was kind of made for white people. So that's where like the comfortability with that idea came from. But, you know, as I learned about like my family's history being Holocaust survivors and like being in sociology, you know, it strayed me away from that a lot. I know that I no longer want to rely on the state. So this is kind of where I lean more towards like social movements and building our alternatives and building these coalitions. And I think that sometimes within sociology, or just like again within like the leftist range, I think of like liberal feminists versus like radical feminists and how they are like always say like they're kind of opposed to each other. Liberal feminists are the one who use the state, they create laws, they think gender equality can come through the state, while radical feminists are like, we need to burn it all down, you know, like the patriarchal structure exists within the state, it must go away. But I think a really important point to make is that, you know, all three of these can be used together. And for example, Republicans are really good at using all three models of transformation. For example, like the January 6th insurrection. So we had Republicans in the state, you know, our president, our vice president, people in Congress that were using the state as a way to progress what they wanted. And at the same time, working together was this group of revolutionaries that attacked, like physically attacked with weapons and crowds, the state, so that they can move forward their ideas that also people in the state agreed with. And then lastly, they have their own alternatives outside of the state, like, you know, QAnon, like the different organizations that they produce outside of the state that creates like this movement towards bringing people together to fight for it. And so they were really able to use all three of those modes. And, you know, they also had people in the judiciary system and so that when they attacked the state, they wouldn't get in trouble for it. And, you know, they were able to create basically this closed system of these modes so that they can create this overall goal that they've been searching for, that they've wanted for a long time, and that they truly have been empowered to do for a long time. So, you know, I just want to kind of state that I also believe that all three of these can be used together. And I think that it is very powerful when they're used together, when everyone has the same goal and have different modes to be able to use it together.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that just brings up a point of, I keep going back to this sense of togetherness. I think that the fact that we have seen certain bills and things that have passed, like to cause people to pretty much go back, right? So like go back to this time, and go back to thinking in this way, and go back home. So going back in so many different ways, right? Because, you know, just like Marina brought up with the riot act or whatnot, and the anti-woke act. And so it's this idea of go back home and go back to, you know, being quiet and things of that sort, because again, this element of power, and recognizing the power that we as people have. And so I really believe, as a sociologist, as a person, that, you know, certain things just don't apply. Like that cannot apply to, you know, us as people. I'm not even sure who or what it applies to, because we have eyes to see, we have ears to hear, and we know, we can see, we can identify when things are being done that are not right. And so, like you said before, there's a big difference between a riot and a protest. And so I don't want to go back to that again, but I just want to drive that point home that, you know, the sense of community and togetherness is so important. And so one philosophy that I realize is this teaching to transgress. And so teaching being not just in a physical classroom, but educating and enlightening and empowering one another, of this idea of it's okay that we are going to go against the status quo or go against the grain. The idea of transgress, right? Like looking at the meaning is to go beyond the bounds and the limitations that have been set. Well, who set them, right? And so this idea of going beyond certain standards of how, you know, we react to things that society determines is misbehaving or doing something wrong, when actually no, it's not. It's called standing up for oneself and being an advocate for those that are being afflicted, those that are being oppressed. And so a person I talked about earlier is Angela Davis, Dr. Angela Davis. And one of the things that I've heard Dr. Davis say is, you know, talking about the prison system. And there's a couple of other people that have talked about this as well, but this idea of how people are treated or what people do, how that is indoctrinated in society and instituted in society. And so I could go a whole another series there by itself, but this idea of teaching to transgress is a book by Bell Hooks, and also an ideology that Bell Hooks theorized. The idea behind it was going from an all-Black school to an all-white school, or majority white school, and having these experiences in one social space, and then having totally different experience and being like ripped apart from one's roots. And so the idea of teaching to transgress is to liberate, right? It's freedom in the classroom, because that was a setting that Bell Hooks was talking about, but also in our lives, being able to speak freely and identify people and see people, and the ability to hear the voices and hear their experiences and not try and shut people out or shut people down or look at people as troublemakers or someone that needs to be disciplined, and then being put out of that space and having to be, suspended or expelled, like if we talk about the school system. Mm-hmm. So this idea comes from empowerment, and empowerment comes from being educated and enlightened and educating ourselves and educating one another, our communities. And this interference that I have seen in education is causing people to feel like they have to be quiet and causing people to feel like their histories don't matter. And so it's important for us as adults, young adults, but it's also important for students in K through 12 to be seen and to be recognized and to go through this lifelong journey of learning and to accept learning and to accept various voices. And so that is really what I am strongly a believer of.
Yeah. And I think what you're bringing up is also, it's not just any knowledge, as some of us have been taught, like, to believe like, oh, knowledge is power, but we understand, and learning from Black feminist theory, the fact that the knowledge that we're talking, and the knowledge that you're talking about, and what Bell Hooks talks about in teaching to transgress is subjugated knowledge. It's knowledge that has been oppressed in the past. It's knowledge by Black people and other people that have been marginalized. It's knowledge that goes against the traditional ideas of truth and what's right and wrong. And so I really like everything that you've just brought up, because it is definitely something that is necessary in our classrooms, and unfortunately that's exactly why they're attacking it. That's right. That's exactly where that comes from. And I think like children, we talked about this a bit in a previous episode, but the idea of protecting children from these ideas, really, that's from my own experience, even in my own research with evangelicals. They really care about them as parents being in control of their children's education. And we could talk about, again, like I said, a whole other series on like the history of it, because we do know that there's a history of, like, with segregation and all of that, and education and parental choice, blah blah blah. But a lot of them do value, like, they want to homeschool their kids, or there's Christian schools. And so it's the idea of wanting to protect their children, but really it's wanting to have control over their children's education so that their children can continue to uphold the tradition, what's always what society has been, and what we call the status quo. So that is what is going on really here when we talk about protecting the children.
And when you bring up that knowledge is so important and for, like, liberation, that's kind of what this podcast is also about, is to educate and to make sure that, people deserve to know what's going on around them and the structures that they exist in. And so this is us trying to teach to transgress. Like, this is why we're having this conversation. This is why we wanted you on the podcast, like that. Your philosophy is directly what inspired this podcast in the first place. So I think that can be really helpful for a lot of people, just like creating knowledge and knowing that knowledge doesn't only come from inside institutions, inside like the ivory towers. It can be from our own lived experience, like we talked about earlier. So I think that's a perfect philosophy to have and to even, like, come on here and talk about, because it's exactly what this was made for.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go into my philosophy. And I think that there's a lot of overlap. I do want to point out I share a lot of the same philosophies that Kristal and Halley bring up. And so for me specifically, I going back to my lived experience, being a Puerto Rican woman, to me, I've learned a lot from the movements that have come out of Puerto Rico throughout history. There's a lot that isn't taught, in history, especially not in the U.S. mainland, about what actually Puerto Ricans actually did to fight back throughout decades of basically colonialism from the U.S. and not just Spain. So I think that my philosophy is a mixture of both, like, first the collective, that collective effort, rather than individualistic idea that neoliberalism puts in our minds. I'm really committed to, again, anti-colonialism, anti-hierarchies, anti-domination. So I would say that I fall more into the like anarchist lane there, but yes. So I think personally I do value, and this comes also from, again, like I said, subjugated knowledge, the knowledge that comes from those who have been oppressed, those who have been colonized, those who have Black feminist thought, for example. I think my philosophy comes from that. It's really based on that and on resisting systems of oppression and trying to dismantle anything that tries to perpetuate any like hierarchy or domination. And so in that same way, I definitely veer off from more like changing things within the system. I'm really into like the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, as Audre Lorde says. I think that we do have to go beyond the systems that currently exist, that are there to just reinforce themselves. I think we do need to go beyond them, and we need to create alternatives that are based on collective self-care, and not just one politician or one political party like trying to save you or have the answers for you. I think we as the people need to be much more engaged, and we need to demand that space for us, that power back for us to rethink how we rethink society as a whole and the future that we want. And we talked about this a little bit in the live that we did, but I quoted Frantz Fanon, and where he discusses how the best way to empower people is not by giving them a political speech, but it's by showing them and empowering them to know that they're in control and that it's on them, that if the nation fails, it's on them, that if the nation succeeds, it's on them, that it's us who need to take that power and make this place what it needs to be. So I think that that's very powerful, and it is definitely rooted in that anti-colonial, anti-domination type philosophy. So that's what I think. It's a lot, but
Yeah, no, thank you everyone for sharing your philosophies. This is kind of just for you as a listener to get an idea of where you can put your action, what you want to do. And thank you, Kristal, again for coming out. We really appreciate your insight on all of this. It was really helpful to have this conversation with you here to kind of guide us through different ways to think through this. So thank you.
Thank you.
And yeah, so this is our last official episode for this chapter. So we'll be coming back in early 2023, and we have some thoughts of what the new chapter will be about, but we'll be a little hush-hush for now. But we're really excited for what this new chapter will bring for us. So make sure to go back and watch this chapter if you haven't listened to all of it, and we hope to see you guys in 2023.
Absolutely. All right. Well, bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
We'd also like to thank the University of Central Florida Department of Sociology for their generous support of this podcast.